the notion that you're going to force the Russians into anything at this point, particularly in Ukraine, is absurd. That would be similar to saying, we're going to force the Americans to come to terms with the Mexicans, and you're sitting in Beijing. It's absurd. It's not going to happen. It's ridiculous. We need to stop talking about that. But this is part of the national narcissism, which is almost terminal inside the Beltway. People can't step away from the possibility that our power is not limitless. The other thing is, given the way things are going in the Middle East, you could be in a major regional war in 30 days, and the price for a barrel of oil could go to $90 or $100 a barrel overnight. So I think this is all nonsense about energy. We're not going to threaten the Russians in any way, shape, or form in a way that makes any sense. Look, what have we done for years? I mean, this hostility to Russia, what good has it done? It's been self-defeating. If there's a lesson to be learned from this disastrous Biden administration, is it's all self-defeating. So let's drop all this silly language and nonsense about how great we are and how we can force this or that. It's all trash. Get rid of it. Dump it. We need to learn a little humility. We're not the only player on the block. President Trump made it very clear to me and anybody else who cared to listen to him years ago that he thought the Europeans should be their own first responders. In other words, this reliance on U.S. forces to go thousands of miles from the continental United States into Europe to marshal air and naval power on a moment's notice to defend Europe was ridiculous. It didn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense from the threat standpoint because Russia doesn't present that kind of threat, nor is Russia interested in it. And he's tried repeatedly to persuade the Europeans they must be responsible for their own defense. I think what probably President Trump would like, and I'm sure Secretary Hegseth would probably be receptive to this, is that fine, if this NATO thing survives, that's great, but you've got to take the lead. And remember, all the times you and I have spoken, the op-eds I wrote saying over and over and over again, a European four-star should replace the American four-star. We've got to get out of the business of taking responsibility for the command and defense of the European theater. That's not our problem. And I think at the end of the day, I think that's really what Secretary Hegseth is saying. Let's get out of this. We'll backstop you. We will stand by you, in the event of a serious conflagration. We'll back you up. But you've got to take the lead and defend yourselves. I think that's very clear. I think that's what President Trump wants, and he should want it, and the Congress should want it. But we all know Congress will fight it because you're disrupting a money flow that's become very, very useful for a lot of people, only not the American people.
Now, let's go down that path for a minute, because I think it's really important. There are a number of voices, both in the United States and definitely in Europe, that are in near panic fear that Trump is going to, get us out of NATO, et cetera, as though that's going to be something that's going to put our national security at great risk or so. I wonder if you can discuss something, because to me, taking the emotion out of it and whatever financial obligations some people may have, or benefits rather, is that when you just look at the fundamentals, wait a minute, when we started NATO in 1949, Europe was still in rubble for the most part from World War II, and economies and militaries, et cetera. And there was a need for U.S., especially to face off against the Soviet threat. But now then you've got all these very, very wealthy countries. And what is your argument against the people who say that we should stay there literally forever, as opposed to saying, no, each of these nations should get back to the historical norm and provide for their own security? What is so bad about that?
Well, there's a vast difference between seeking to preserve the freedom and liberty of nations in the aftermath of a terrible war that did not fall under communist occupation, and staying somewhere in perpetuity on the grounds that if we leave, there may be disputes or conflicts. Well, I have a newsflash. There have been disputes and conflicts all over the world for thousands of years, long before we existed. There will be more conflicts and disputes after we're dead. In other words, once we leave, will there be a potential for disputes and conflicts? Yes. But the Europeans, certainly before the First World War, demonstrated pretty conclusively after the Napoleonic Wars that they could handle those things. I think we're living in a different age now. I don't see any interest in Germany among any Germans in invading France, or the French are not interested in fighting with the Italians or the Spaniards. I mean, this stuff's over with. Eastern Europe, there's some unfinished business, let's be frank. And that's going to come to the fore. Hungary lost a great deal in World War I and even more after the Second World War. That's unfinished business. There's unfinished business for them in Ukraine. There's unfinished business with Poland in Ukraine. But these things are not our affair. And these things will have to be sorted out regionally. I think the world collectively, ever since the 1970s, has been moving towards greater regionalization, Dan. In other words, instead of seeing the global community as a community, we need to see the global population organized into regions with major powers in each of the region that operate as arbitrators and maintain peace, security, and build prosperity. This is something that was predicted by a man named Hedley Bull at Oxford, long before anybody wrote The Fourth Turning or Toffler's Waves or anything else. I think we're there. I think Europe will devolve to some extent into new regions, because the problem in NATO was always the same. The view of things from Berlin did not match the view from Madrid, and the view from Paris had nothing to do with the view from Stockholm or Athens. And that's more true now than ever. So I think you're going to see new security arrangements emerge, which is fine. They should, because they have a greater chance of succeeding than anything we impose. And right now, NATO is a legacy of our imposition. Let's be frank. That's
and another thing, Doug, this is there has been, and I've heard this many times throughout most of my adult life, is that the view in the United States, especially, is that, well, look, we quote had to go to Europe to help them in World War I, and then we had to go back in World War II to help them. So we need to keep all this stuff going now in NATO into perpetuity, because otherwise we'll have to go back again. That's just how it is. That seems to me kind of an arrogant assumption, then also that you can predict the future. But let's look at the fundamental of that. Would the United States, quote, have to go back to Europe and fight a war if any of those groupings you just mentioned turn into conflict?
Well, if you're asking, how do we intervene militarily? Is that the question?
No, the question is, should we intervene? Is that something in America's interest to do?
No, I don't think so. And the other issue is, how can we? Eisenhower pointed out when he was president, a group of Army generals came in to but make presentations to the president about their need for more transportation to move more forces to Europe. And they said they had to have 29 divisions in Europe to stop the Soviets. And he said, how many divisions have you got that you could conceivably send? Well, we only have 15 divisions. He said, well, then find out what the shipping requirements are and the aviation requirements are to move 15 divisions. You're not getting anything more than that. Well, that took the wind out of their sails. But then he privately pointed out, look, we're never going to get across the Atlantic and the Pacific again the way we did during World War II. It can't be done, or World War I. The submarines, the long-range precision strike, the growing overhead constellation of ISR, he said this is going to be impossible. So if we put something over there, it stands an excellent chance of ending up at Dunkirk, a giant Dunkirk. And even then, we may never get the troops out. I mean, one of the things people don't realize is that Dunkirk was a miracle, simply because Hitler stopped the advance of the Germans. Right. Had they advanced, you'd have had 300,000 prisoners of war without any trouble at all. It would be much worse today. So the whole idea, this old paradigm, is dead. We can't repeat any of that. So the answer is no. The Europeans must take the lead. They must take responsibility for their own security.
We actually had Colonel Jacques Beau, a former NATO officer, on the show last week, who made that one of those very important points there also, that in the event of a new general war, he said the United States would have almost no ability to move the vast quantities of equipment and ammunition and everything else, which would have to come by sea because of all the things you mentioned there. So he said you could try, but it would almost certainly end up at the majority of the bottom, because the U.S. doesn't have the requisite anti-submarine capacity to be able to do that. And it would take years to build. So then that leads me to the question, Doug, what is the best way for the United States to ensure its national security? What should we focus on if we're interested in making sure we stay safe so we don't get into a war we don't need to fight or lose our military trying to get there?
Well, our focus really ought to be on the Western Hemisphere. Defense of the Western Hemisphere is critical now. Our country's in a lot of trouble. Our open borders have created chaos here inside the United States. And that's what's most important of all. There's going to be very little that we can do beyond our borders. We're in a position very similar to the British Empire at the turn of the century. The British Empire had a marvelous navy. We have a good navy. We have good air forces. There are places we can go if we need to temporarily, but we cannot become a permanent presence anywhere because we are ultimately a maritime and aerospace country. We're not a land power anywhere but in the continental United States, which is why I keep arguing you got to get the Army back here, and you got to get the Army back in the business of national defense, which is defense of our borders, defense of the United States. So that's the first answer to the question. The second part of it is, yes, in small numbers, depending upon the situation, we can lend support or assistance to someone. But even then, it's very risky. You know, the British tried to rescue the Greeks who came under attack by the Italians and the Germans. And the great British Navy did all that it could, but it was no match for the German Air Force and the German Army. And it would play out very similarly with the Russians. So I'm afraid we've got to be very careful about promises we make that we can never keep. So we ought to back away, encourage people to do what is in their interest, and consider carefully the limitations of our abilities to support anybody else beyond the Western Hemisphere.